when to trim. Okay. All right. Hello, this is week 3 of Art 102, Understanding Art / Art Appreciation / Intro to Art. Welcome back. This is my husband Gerard. And then, we'll just get started. Today there is more than about 150 slides. So the way I'm going to approach this is, I'm going to go through it really quickly. Obviously, I'm trying to get it done within an hour. So there's a link in the description below for the link to the slideshow if you want to look at it later. So I'm not going to be able to get through everything, but I'm going to try to cover everything. Usually this is at 2 to 3 lectures, but I'm putting it into one. All right, so first we're going to talk about this. All right, so in the following slides, you'll see these terms, bits and composition. What bits means is basically these things that make up the composition. So these are this lightning bolt, this arrow, this word chonies. These are the bits, and all of this put together within this white rectangle, that's the composition. Okay, so composition meaning the whole of the parts. I could have said parts instead of bits, but it's more distinct. All right, so we're going to start off with the elements of art. And what's important to note about this is that this is nowhere near universal, these elements of art. It'll be different from book to book, from teacher to teacher. I just picked ones that made the most sense and that I've been taught. And I've also corroborated with a textbook and other instructors, so I'm not just picking at random. I'm picking what makes the most sense and what's been useful for me. Line. Okay, so line's interesting because it's a 1D thing. So a point is 0 dimensions. And yes, we're talking about 0D, 1D, 2D, 3D. So line is a series of points. If you put a bunch of them in a row like this, eventually becomes a line. And a line can curve. It does go in a 2-dimensional space. It can go like that. But you want to think of it as in a light rail, where it can only go back and forth, as opposed to being able to go left and right. Obviously, that would not be good. So snakes, like my daughter, she's also one-dimensional in the sense that she usually just goes like straight along the line, but that's just kind of a silly joke. Isn't she beautiful? And here's a cool little video that you can watch on your own about a game on 1D, 1 dimension. So even though it curves up here, you can only go like forward and backwards, right? So 1D is just a way to say you can only go forwards and backwards and not left to right or up and down. All right. And so line is a very important part of art, obviously. Here's a representation of different possible ways you can represent line to evoke certain emotions or feelings. And so I'm going to talk about different types of lines. So gestural line is what you see here. When you want to make something quick, a quick sketch, when you're on the phone and you're doodling along, which does help with memory, by the way. And sometimes these are used in complete artworks like Lee Krasner. Her husband's this little known guy called, oh my goodness, I forgot his name. Jackson Pollock. Might have heard of him, but she is a lot cooler anyways. Contour lines, which is what I'm doing in my drawing class, is basically the outline of an object without the details inside. Calligraphic lines is calligraphy, basically fancy-ass writing, fancy lines that are meant to be decorative, made into a pretty design. And here's examples of calligraphy poems that my mom wrote. It's a combination of drawing and writing, more or less. Takes a lot of discipline. I wouldn't have the discipline to do that. So good job, Mom. Cross hatching. So cross hatching is a way to, when you only have a certain width of pen, this is probably the best way to represent shading by crossing lines like such. You can see on the left, here's an example of if you want the facade of the house to appear in shadow, you use cross hatching. Notice that the artist doesn't have shading otherwise, it's just pen lines. Same thing with this cover. You can use color as well and put the lines, the cross hatching on the colors to make it appear darker. All right, phantom lines and closure. So this is more in the terms of psychology of what your brain perceives versus what is there. So obviously we know this is Pikachu, the electric rat from Pokemon. And we know that because we're familiar with his shape, or their shape, with the cheeks, the eyes, the expression, the tail, etc. Even though there's no outline to really define what this is, we still know from experience that, okay, our brain is wanting to make sense of this. So that's what it does. Okay, that's Pikachu. Same thing with this S right here. And on the bottom right, there is no white triangle here, but it appears to be just because these lines are kind of cut in a really weird way that doesn't make sense. So our brain kind of sees there's a white triangle on top of these. This is a trailer to a game called Closure, which is all about that. You can go ahead and watch it. I haven't played it yet, but it seems pretty interesting. Oops. Okay. And now we have implied lines. So these are actually invisible lines that don't exist, but they're kind of there in the same way that phantom lines are. They don't exist, but you can kind of see them. So think about the movement throughout this composition where the lines go through. Spoiler alert, here it is. And then here's Raft of the Medusa by Theodore Géricault, which I showed last week, I believe. Yeah, and so think about all the lines that might be going on here. This is the prime example in art history to talk about lines and stuff. So there's some lines going on like that. Wavy to sort of lead your eye throughout the composition. And then there's also like counterpoints and organic lines and things that go against this, right? There's an infinite amount of lines here, like here, for example, the horizon. Where are these guys looking at? It's this little ship right here, right? Yeah, so implied lines, again, don't exist, just like these phantom lines. And yeah. All right, horizontal lines. So horizontal lines, as it says on the slide, pretty self-explanatory. We think of these generally as more chill because they're parallel to the earth. You think about rest. Think about when you're laying down, there's less energy expended by doing that. And so we think about things like laying down flat in general. When it comes to horizontal lines, this composition, how it's more landscape, how it's wider than it is taller, that provides a sense of view of a wider landscape, which means more room, right? And the color scheme here is pretty relaxing, and that also helps contribute to the feeling of rest and relaxation. And we'll talk about colors later. Vertical lines are pretty much the opposite, where they're about strength. They quote unquote defy gravity, and literally in this case, with this little guy right here. And now we're putting this at a portrait orientation, which is taller than it is wider. And so that makes us look up and down and think about objects and subjects within a vertical context, right? Whereas here, we think about like, okay, we're moving from left to right. This is we're moving from up to down, right? And even vertical lines in here, in this horizontal composition, you're going to think about going down here, going up here. And this, you're going to think about going here to here. However, the verticality overpowers that here, and the horizontality overpowers the verticality here. So think about how that works psychologically. And now let's talk about diagonal lines. In film studies, it's called a Dutch angle, where you shoot at an angle like this. This implies motion, unrest, instability. Because think about when you're walking in the forest, there's a nice lush ground that's a very nice foundation to hold up the vertical trees. But if you see a tree that's on its side or diagonal, with a diagonal line, that seems very unstable. Obviously, it means like the tree's dead and falling down or whatever, or someone cut it down. And again, that's instability because it's neither at its most active up and down or pretty much dead and waiting to be consumed by the earth when it's horizontal. It's an in-between state. All right, shape. Now we're moving to 2 dimensions. So again, the line is basically one-dimensional. It exists in every dimension. But again, when we're talking about line, that's 1 dimension. And now we're talking about shapes, which are 2-dimensional. So I specifically wanted to use a graph because there's an x-axis and a y-axis, right? And so this ghost shape, which is very silly and cute, that is a 2D shape, which means there's a line that makes a full circuit without a break in it. However, if you do get rid of one of these little lines here, that will turn into a line and become 1-dimensional technically, but it's still pretty much a shape, just open. So the 1-dimensional line and 2-dimensional shape, they're not 100% bulletproof or waterproof rather, but they're general guidelines to how this works. Okay, obviously we've known forever there's many different kinds of shapes, but there's different classifications. So the regular ones are the ones that we're used to, that we're able to name right away. Organic shapes are basically irregular shapes that don't have perfect geometry. You could zigzag them, make them accidental with spills, and you can also mix regular and organic together, of course, like Swiss cheese, right? This is something to read on your own, organic versus geometric. That's something to read on your own, basically boba versus kiki, how that sounds psychologically. And here's an example in a game called Bioforce Utopia within a larger game called Utopias, where basically what you have to do is you have a gun that shoots these these robots, these slick metal man-made geometric shapes with basically seeds. So you turn these machines into plant hosting devices. So you're basically contrasting, trying to put everything back to nature. All right, figure-ground relationship, and yes, this is still in shapes. So figure-ground's the way of perceiving how a shape is in relationship to the other part of it. So the figure, this is an example, the heart, is an easy one because outside of it, the ground, which is what the figure, which is what we're looking at, that's what it's on. The heart is a figure. The background is the ground. Makes sense, right? So this is kind of easy. The medium is the WWF panda, where, again, just like Pikachu, there's no lines to indicate this is a full shape. So this is a little bit more difficult to process. It's very easy, actually. But just because it's an illusion, it's obviously not a real panda, but it's obviously not just random markings on the page. It's supposed to represent a panda just because we know pandas are black and white. They have markings that look like this. So that we understand the figure with the ground, which is the figure is the most important part, of course, and the ground is the background, essentially. And the background, or sorry, the ground bleeds into this, so it's a little bit more confusing that way. Whereas with the heart, it's completely separate, right? And this one is just, the figure is the ground, and the ground is the figure, and the figure is the figure, and the ground is the ground. So this is Escher, MC Escher. Does a lot of art like this, where the figure and the ground are mixed up. Form, mass, and volume. And now we're going to 3 dimensions. All right, so these are both circles. We both understand them as circles drawn on a page, right? And this is now on our screen. So they're just flat circles. We cannot physically touch them. Of course, the one on the left we see more as 2D because there's no sort of volume to describe it. Whereas the shading here, which is supposed to imitate real life shading, meaning there's a bright point, there's a shadow, and this is called a bounce light down here. That's why it's lighter down here. That sort of helps us think of it in 3-dimensional terms, even though these are simply just pencil marks drawn on in a very specific way. It sort of gives us an illusion of this thing that is 3-dimensional, even though, of course, it's not. And same happens with this Georgia O'Keeffe painting. We see this receding into the distance. This is perspective, which we'll talk about later. So there's implied or unreal or illusionistic mass, because we can imagine these things having weight. I guess these are ice flows. And then this sculpture by Richard Serra, which is way above head height. It's probably like 10 feet. There's a bunch of them. Richard Serra sculptures are those kind of things where you'll see them in person, or you'll see them in photos and think, that's kind of a waste of metal. But when you see them in person and then experience them and walk around them, it is kind of impressive. You still might think it's a waste of metal, but at least it gives a really weird sense of scale, which is another thing we'll talk about. And then mask here is kind of interesting, right? Think about this on your own about why this is kind of funny, if it's funny to you. So 3D shapes, height, length, and depth. So these are the 3 dimensions: height, length, and depth, whereas 2 dimensions only has height and length, and 1 dimension has only one of these, whichever one you want. We'll skip that. We don't need that. Don't need that. Again, this is a 3D form on 2D. Why do we know it's 2D? Why do we know it's 3D? Well, because we have perspective, which again we'll talk about later, and it has a sense of mass, because we can imagine that these are buildings with all these shadows and highlights and such. All right, space. Space is basically how the bits relate to each other within a composition, and also how they relate to the composition itself. So this is a 2D and 3D thing, well, and 1D as well. So here's a lot of little things about different types of object interactions. I'm not going to go over them, but just this is something to go over on yourself. But you want to think about how throughout these slides, how these objects interact with each other. They might give a little bit of personality off. It might make things more active. You might be able to create little stories out of them. If you're imaginative, you might think about the relationship with each other and how that's important for them to relate to each other. I said the same thing twice. And that's important to think about context, right? Because just one circle is a lot different than one circle that's like kind of falling off of this line when these other ones are here, or this one's a little bit off, this one's a little bit off in a different way. Think about the context of how things relate to one another. All right, I think I'm making decent time. All right, positive negative space. So positive and negative space is pretty close to the figure ground relationship. However, it's more defined, not totally defined. But it's kind of easier and less about perception and more about what is here. So the negative space is this literal space around these buildings. And we'll talk about like emphasis or focus later on. But we know this is positive space because this is where stuff's mostly going on. Even though there's like little stars and little blocks floating out in this negative space, since it's less sparse and it's not directly in front of us, that tends to be negative space. So where the positive and negative spaces here in this here, it's very obvious. It's just this gray space all around these two characters hugging. Here it's a little less obvious. And you can argue different things. So I would say if the negative space is just this blurry background around this beautiful creature, right? Some might say this is a negative space. I don't necessarily think so. I think negative space in terms of what's behind you, what's grounding this. And I think this is more of a foreground than a negative space because it's a very important part of the composition. And we would have a wolf floating in space like this if we didn't have this. And so I think of negative space as being, you could replace it with something else and it's okay. All right, perspective. So perspective is super important because without it, everything would look 2D to us. Everything would be flat, like a drawing. So perspective is how objects relate to each other in space. But when it comes to 2D, the way we talk about it is how the illusion of space happens. Pardon me. So again, everything on the screen is two-dimensional. But these things appear 3D just because of perspective, how we see things in space. Like if we have an object to the right of us and we're doing a one-dimensional point, it'll have a vanishing point in front of us. Like when you're driving down a really long road in the desert and the road comes to a vanishing point, it just comes to a point right there. That's perspective because it's leading you to the horizon line in the center. All right, here's a nice video about it. 1 point perspective. So we define the number of point perspectives by the number of vanishing points. So just like I said with the road, all of this kind of leads to this 1 point right here and the vanishing point. So that's the reason we call it a 1 point perspective as opposed to a 2 point perspective. As you can see, this is much different. There's 1 point here and 1 point here. So these lines on the left side of the building, they're pointing towards this, and on the right side of the buildings, they're pointing towards this. And in 3 dimensions, the top and bottom points, they converge down here. So this is 3 main vanishing points. So I'm going to show you again. This is 1 point perspective, which is very easy to get a hang of. 2 point perspective and 3 point perspective. It's much harder to differentiate between 2 and 3 point perspective right off the bat. Honestly, it's kind of hard for me to do it. And these are actually kind of hard in general unless you have a clear horizon point. So in my room, there's no clear horizon point. I don't really have decorations in my room. It's pretty plain. So I don't see where my eye meets the horizon, right? Whereas here, this is where our eye line is. These are where eye line. That's where eye line is, and yeah, this is where our eye lines are. We have 3 eyes. Is that how it works? I'm not exactly sure, to be honest. It's a matter of perspective. Um, for the 6-point perspective, so these are things that you'll never use. I mean, unless you're really into optical illusions, but I've never used them before in my drawings. Could be fun. I don't know the difference between 4 and 5-point. Well, I guess there's a dot here. 6-point is just, I think that just means like kind of cubic. Yeah, so this is like basically 5-point is describing the sphere in front of you. 6-point describing the view in front of you and in back of you. Atmospheric perspective. So this isn't like this is more of a visual perspective than a scientific vanishing points perspective, or mathematical, I should say. This happens because of distance, especially on foggy days, and this is because there's a lot of air particles that kind of build up over distance, and the further you are, the more air particles are in front of you. So that's why it's easier to see clearly in front of here and harder back there. Okay, check that out on your own. So this is an easy way to think about perspective. So this is a self-portrait of Gerhard Richter, and he's obviously the same size because this was taken in the same studio. I doubt it was taken more than a couple minutes between each shot, but there's 3 shots of him. And so think about, okay, so his body size remains constant. Why does his body size change size? It's because of perspective, because there's this, he's farther back in space here than he is here, obviously, right? He doesn't grow, or he doesn't shrink to a smaller size. It's that he's further back, and we can tell because there's little hints like the what is it called? The orthogonal lines, which is basically like the tops and bottoms of buildings, how they point to the vanishing point. Those kind of have a bit of perspective. This is kind of going up slightly. This one's going up a little bit more. And this top part up here is going up even further. So that kind of gives us a clue to, okay, like this guy just didn't change sizes 3 times in one photo. Texture. So there's 2 types of texture we talk about in art. The first is actual texture, which is fur you can actually feel, or texture you can actually feel. So I think this is a ferret. I'm 92% sure. So the ferret with the blankies, those have textures you can physically feel, right? Obviously not in the screen, but on the right, this is implied texture. So these are just digital paintings. You can't physically touch them, obviously, since they're just digital paintings. But they have the illusion of having softness, like this bunny butt, right? We have the fur here, we have the fur here. If we could touch this in real life, we could feel it. Well, if this was in real life, we would be able to feel it. But these are just paintings, again, so they're only implied to have texture without actually having texture. Okay, here's a couple more examples. Real texture and fake texture, which is done through skillful use of paint. Okay, and impasto. So impasto's basically building up of textures using thick paint and probably some medium. Medium meaning something you combine with the paint to give more texture or smooth it out. A medium does different things. So everyone's familiar with Van Gogh and how he has a lot of chunky bits in his paintings, but we'll be talking about white canvases later on this term, how it makes some people upset. But yeah, Robert Ryman uses a lot of texture in his work. Here's a bird. Color. Okay, so color is usually a full lecture that I do. Um, However, there's other things that I thought were more important, unfortunately. Color is my favorite thing. So I'm going to have to get through this pretty quickly. So color is basically what we see is reflected off something. So this is a good diagram to wrap your head around. It's a funny comic. So we perceive light through the rods in our eyes. So within our eyes, we have red cones, green cones, and blue cones. And each of those represent different color wavelengths we're able to perceive. So people who are colorblind, for example, who have the blue cones damage, they're unable to see blue, right? And they can only see red, and they can't differentiate red. I think I'm getting that right. I think it's not the opposite. Rods are the way we see light and darkness, but that's not our concern. So RGB color space, additive color. So when you think of RGB color, think about what you think about. So basically, a way to think about this, I'm saying that word a lot, is think about projection and light. All right, so this diagram shows a blue light, a green light, and a red light intersecting. And when they all meet, notice that the light gets lighter and it turns into a white. So additive color space means when you add, you get white together. Okay, so this is present in projectors, our monitors, phones, RGB color space. Think about vibrancy and brightness. This is a really cool video. You'll have to look at it on your own. And subtractive color is basically you subtract to get white, meaning like basically you add to get black or closer to black. So things like paint or highlighters or pens, those are subtractive colors because they're not emitting light, they're reflecting light, and they absorb light. So it's doing the opposite of what additive color is. And so CMYK is a result of mixing red, green. Wait, this is blue. This is green and this is red. So when we mix red and blue subtractive light or additive light, we get magenta. When we do blue and green, we get cyan. When we get green and red, we get yellow, which is kind of weird to think about when we're thinking about color wheels. But that's how it works with additive and subtractive light. So yeah, this is writing stuff down. And when you'll see CMYK, what does the K mean? It usually means either key or black. And this is what we use in printers, CMYK. If you've ever replaced printer ink, it's expensive. However, just a quick secret, you can order special ink online where it comes with a syringe and a bottle of ink that you can refill on your own for so much cheaper. Just FYI. So yeah, the reason when we're printing CMYK why we do that is if we're only printing black, we're only going to use the black ink. If we're going to use different colors, why not just mix the CMY together to make black? Well, it usually turns out to be a dark brown, and it wastes a lot of ink where you could just use black. So black is usually the biggest cartridge if there's a difference at all. And so this is counterintuitive to what we know because we're taught red, yellow, and blue are the primary colors. It's just an outdated thing. It still works, but it was before we understood the rods and cones and mixing and subtracting light. So it's still in place today apparently because it's easier for kids to understand. Frankly, I think kids are much smarter. Whew. All right. I have 3 minutes to get through the rest of this. Okay, so I have to rush. HSB hue is the color itself. Saturation is how vibrant it is. It's either really vibrant purple or just white. And brightness is how bright it is or how dark it is. Gamut, don't worry about that. Again, the color wheel. This is based on red, yellow, blue. Red, yellow. I can't believe I'm like misnaming colors. And I've studied art since like 2008. It's just like the time after I graduated or after I finished calculus. I still have a hard time adding and subtracting. Yeah, so basically the color wheel is based on red, yellow, blue. However, you can customize it in whatever way serves you best. It's usually divided into warm colors and cool colors. Warm colors range from like pinkish purple to yellow, and green to purple for cool. So red colors, they have a sort of warm psychological feel to it. So brown is actually basically dark orange, just FYI. So this qualifies as red, orange, yellow. Yeah, think about the associations of like, why is it called warm? Does that make sense to you? Yeah, some more examples. Cool colors. This is an obvious example because snow is white. When we see shadows on snow, they're blue. And there's green forest. So this is obviously a very cool, chilly scene. Oh, shoot. I'm way behind in this lecture. So, yeah, think about coolness. Yeah, lack of energy, lack of temperature, etc. Here's combining this. So here in this game called ARE Memories of Old, you're guided by this light that's warm, and below you is blue, which is cool. So it has this sort of psychological effect of you're safe here, it might be dangerous down there. Complementary colors, red and green are the opposite. Think of the festive Christmas colors. This is a bit more muted. Watch this video on your own. Analogous colors is when colors are next to each other on the color wheel. Yeah, that's analogous colors as well. Triadic colors are a lot less common, so this would be when they're equidistant from each other. Red, yellow, blue is very rare to see. This image are from last year because I had a hard time finding more than one example. In this, red, yellow, and blue is a primary example, primary colors. But the opposite is orange, green, purple. Secondary colors, which you don't need to learn primary and secondary. That's a little bit too much. Split complementary is so hard to find. I'm not 100% sure this is split complementary, but it's hard to get exact. I think this is split complementary with different values, which we'll get to, and darknesses. Tetradic is basically, the thing isn't here, but basically it's two opposites. So red and green, and yellow and purple. And these are pretty ugly most of the time. All right, so fun fact. Achromatic means black and white. And that means no color in it at whatsoever. Just black, gray and white, like so. Monochromatic is when you add the color in. So these are all monochromatic. These would actually be achromatic. Can they be considered achromatic and monochromatic? I don't see why not. Honestly, like, don't be that person who corrects people every time they say they're looking at black and white and say, oh, that's achromatic, not monochromatic. No one cares. I think that all the time, but I'm like, but I only mention it when I think the person would actually appreciate it. But Other than this class, calling this monochromatic, it's fine. No big deal. All right, local color versus observed color. So this, I think, is really important to think about. Local color is the literal color we see under normal white light, which is 5,500 Kelvin for those who keep count. Under white brightness of light, these are red strawberries. However, this is an additive color change. That's a Photoshop filter, basically. We have a 50% cyan filter on it. These strawberries are actually gray. They're not red that are tinted blue. And you can see here, it's an illusion, and our mind sort of compensates. Okay, I know there's this cyan filter on it. However, I'm going to see these strawberries as red because that's what they should appear as, especially since we see this image here. And this is how color balance in photography works. And the way, I could talk about this for a long time, but basically the reason even though this is orange right here, and these are blue, and this is white. The reason we see these as white is because of this phrase, color constancy, because our brain knows the quote unquote reality of what we see. So it compensates for that. And here's an example of Duncan in this comic. You can see he's obviously green here, but he changes to dark blue or purple here, or indigo, one of those, because of the light changes. But we still understand that he's the same character here. We just have this color constancy going on. And there's a GIF or GIF of how the color changes it. Colors and symbolism, that is a whole thing in itself, so I'm just gonna skip it. You can have fun on your own. All right, 15 minutes. Value, the amount that I love you so much it can't fit on this page. But it just means how bright or light a thing is. Like this painting on the left by Helen Frankenthaler, very light values, right? There's nothing that's very dark. It's low contrast. We'll talk about contrast later. And this one on the right has dark and light values. The dark values being the black, of course, and the light values being the pure white. And then again with the color constancy thing, think about how value is represented here. Fox. So if you're in my class, one of the questions is about a fox in a bubble bath, or about a fox. The correct answer is fox in a bubble bath. All right, so this is the second section that I should have started 5 minutes ago. So these are the principles of design. Again, these are very, very, very varied. They change from source to source. And so what I did is I found from the top 10 Google results, I sort of made a graph of what were the most popular ones, and I sort of, got a rough idea of what those are. And so if you happen to fail this class and have to take it again with another teacher, they'll probably tell you something slightly different. But the principles of design are different because they effectively communicate ideas, whereas the elements of art are just tools to bring ideas about into the world. I'm not sure if I mentioned that, but that was kind of important. So balance. So it refers to how a composition is laid out. Symmetrical means they're distributed evenly. Asymmetrical is the opposite. Okay, so this page has examples of a symmetrical balance, right? So this composition, the interpretation of dreams, this has 4 panels. Even though it's not a perfect square, they are split evenly within the center in the X and Y axis. And there's one object in each panel, and there's writing in each panel. So even though the objects are different, they're different colors, different shapes, different materials, different textures that are implied. There's enough visual balance there that your eye doesn't really... It might automatically go to the yellow because it's the brightest. But generally, the whole composition has equal weight on every side of it. Same thing with the one on the right. Even though it's a maze with a lot of twists and turns and it's kind of wacky, there's these things sticking up on the top of buildings over here, and there's a boat down here. It still has a pretty good balance because even though there's things sticking up down here, there are things more or less sticking down here, so it's balanced in that way. And especially with this crane here and this crane here, those have a lot of balance. And what's interesting is within it there's a lot of variation, but if you squint, it just kind of looks samey, you know. And this is the opposite, asymmetrical balance, where obviously your eye is more pulled towards the right. It may, if you're really, really like attracted to blue for some reason, you might go to the left, but there's so much quote unquote action or stuff going on the right side compared to the left side, because the left side we read as empty, even though it has the same amount of paint, maybe, probably, as the right side. It's still visually empty. There's less going on. There's no action going on. Where on the right, there's butterflies with the shadows floating, you know. There's a little bit, it's a little bit thrown off with this right here, but overall, because this also has shadows here and here, the right side is where I tend to go towards. Contrast. Okay, this is how things are in relation to each other, their distinctness or how different they are. So this is a high contrast text, where the green and black vibrate off each other, and it's very different from the background, whereas this might be hard to see, which I did on purpose, because it's low contrast, because the text is pretty similar to the background. So this is obviously high contrast because these colors just kind of vibrate off each other, right? Neither one necessarily has more or less weight. You just kind of go back and forth. There's a lot of contrast going on, and even then, there's contrast between these shapes and the background, the figure and the ground. So although this is technically very light green, we're going to pretend it's black and white. So black and white is the ultimate contrast. That's why papers are printed black on white, right? And so we have the maximum amount of visibility on here. The forms here are distinct from the background. So this little guy here, they're just made of black and white, of course. But the white blends into the face and the hand, that's how I'm reading it. Figure ground relationship. But they're very distinct from each other, right? There's no mistaking the hair from the background. There's no mistaking the moon from the night sky. So those have a very high amount of contrast. Emphasis or emphasis is the use of one element standing out from the other. And if you didn't catch it, the way I'm using the text to define these things exemplifies these. So this is from the game Myst, where the emphasis is obviously on this book. There's plenty of textures and weird stuff going on in the background. There's red light, these sewer doors maybe, these machines. However, the emphasis is placed on here for a couple reasons. Number one, it's front and center in front of the screen. And number two, it's lit up the brightest. Well, and also number three, it's literally on a pedestal. So it's begging you to look at it, right? So there's a major emphasis there. It would be nice if you looked at this too, but this is what you really need to look at. Here's a picture of a stuffed animal. Oh my gosh. What kind of animal is this? Puma? No, I can't remember. Anyways, so he's like this very bright, silly spot of color and shape and form in this middle of a of black office wear, which is boring. Office furniture, sorry. Carpet here, yeah, that's boring. But so the emphasis is here because we're looking straight at him, and he's surrounded by boring stuff, essentially. So this is a very interesting thing about emphasis. Where is it for you? I would say there's two different points of emphasis. It depends on where you go to first. So you can think of Senua, that's her name here, this character, as the emphasis because she's the biggest, most solid object in here. I want to call her an subject, sorry. So she's standing right in front of the camera, and you're basically playing as her in the third person view. Or you can think it's right here where the sunlight bleeds through this giant structure, which is where Senu was looking at, where you ultimately want to go. And this is how game developers try to get you to move through levels by placing emphasis on where you need to go by making this big and important. They're called weenies. That's based on the Disneyland thing. I forgot what it's called, but yeah, they're called weenies. All right. 6 minutes. Scale and proportion. So scale and proportion is how things relate to each other as far as size goes, or sometimes metaphorical weight. So in this example, these are all roughly the same size, relative to like the Empire State Building. But if this is a family, I know this is Bluey. I know this is Bandit. I forgot her name. But they're from an Australian kids show called Bluey, I think. So based on scale and proportion, who is who? So my first instinct would say, well, this is probably a father or an uncle or something because he's bigger and we know that these do look like little kids. Based on scale and proportion, like the eyes are bigger proportionally, and they're smaller, like almost 2/3 the size of Bandit. So yeah, this is probably the dad based on the scale and how big he is in relation to the other creatures. Here's a really unsettling thing about if you change the scale of legs on sharks, which they don't have legs, this is what happens. And same thing with teddy bears, right? So it'd probably be normal if its legs weren't so long. Yeah, just read the review. Hierarchy. So hierarchy is a way we read things in order, essentially. So the hierarchy here is kind of obvious. Who or what is the most important subject in this? Is it the teacher here or the pupil here? I've never said pupil in my life. Why did I say that? I would say the hierarchy here shows that this bear is because not only is he in front of the camera, quote unquote camera, but like this pupil is off to the side. We don't see their whole body, and their dress seems kind of similar, but this might be a little bit more fancy. So you can read into things for hierarchy. Here's an example of visual hierarchy written in words, usually when it comes to comics and drawing. And this is interesting use of non-hierarchy. So in websites, it's usually the website's name is big here. This is where you are. And then like the options are smaller and the less important ones are smaller. But this is an interesting website of there's no hierarchy here. Everything's kind of the same. You can read it top to bottom, left to right, but everything has an equal amount of visual weight. Unity and variety. So unity is how similar they are, variety is how different they are. This is a lot of unity because even though I don't know if they're the same creature, they probably are different ones. Horseshoe crabs, they're all pretty much the same color, and they're kind of pretty much identical to each other. Whereas variety here is just a bunch of different dudes hanging out. They're all completely different. They're all best friends. I don't know. I just made that up. Uni and variety in this image. So the uni is within the hat. So the variety is how the hats connect to each other. Like it's orange here, yellow here, green here. It's fun to be able to mix those up. Pattern and repetition. So that's how things repeat within a composition. Best repeats. It's a diamond. These are stairs, even though it's not exact as this. This still has that repetition and pattern. 3 stripes going up these stairs. Rhythm and movement. All right, so movement implies motion within an image. Rhythm shows something kind of dancing. They are can be interchangeable, but not necessarily. So on the left, this is definitely more of a movement thing. How do we know he's not just like suspended in midair, other than obviously people can't do that? It's because of these motion lines, right? With this photograph, we see that there's a lot of motion going on. You can also kind of imply that, well, he's probably going from here to here, and the fisheye or the angle, how it makes the orthogonal lines kind of bend like that, kind of put an emphasis onto where he's going. And that's Lucian Clark. And this is more of a rhythm where they're just lines. They're just lines. But however, these breaks in the lines kind of like gave you a sense of space, space, space. Right? So that has somewhat of a rhythm. And this has both. So this has a rhythm to it because it's going up or diagonal up and down. Also, it appears to actually be moving. It is a optical illusion. So it's 17 o'clock. I just finished. Thanks, dear Kathy. Good to see you. So yeah. So if you're part of my class, stick around for the Zoom. Go to Discord for the link. If not, thanks for watching. Hope you learned something. Hopefully I wasn't going too fast. And feel free to look at this, the rest of the things on your own if you have more time. So y'all take care. Bye-bye.